He thought he was just delivering food. But that night at 2 a.m., someone wasn't hungry for a meal. They were starving for something else entirely. The streets at 2 a.m. were not kind to old bones. The wind sliced sharper, the silence was heavier, and the weight of headlights behind a helmet visor could make anyone feel invisible. But for Mr. Nam, people just called him Uncle Nam, this time of night had become a second home. The city was quieter then, less judgmental, less crowded, less quick to point out that he was 72 and still delivering banh mi in a scooter so old it sounded like a wheeze with wheels. No one knew where Uncle Nam lived. He never took breaks at the restaurant. He didn't talk much to the other drivers, most of them young enough to be his grandchildren. They called him Grandpa Fast as a joke because he wasn't. He didn't mind, because he wasn't here for speed. He was here for something else. Or maybe he didn't know anymore. That night started like any other. A couple of deliveries before midnight. One to a drunk office worker. One to a group of students pulling an all-nighter. He was about to end his shift when the order came through. Bang me, no drink. Deliver ASAP. Please don't ring the bell. Just knock and say hello. That's all I ask. The location was an old apartment complex. One Nam didn't usually service. It was a little outside his normal range. But something in the note tugged at him. He accepted, climbed onto a scooter, and drove through the hollow city. The apartment door was on the 4th floor. No elevator. The stairs creaked. When he arrived, he saw the door was slightly ajar. That was odd. He knocked gently anyway. A voice called out, "Is it you?" Nam cleared his throat. "Yes, food delivery." "Can you say that again?" He paused. "Food delivery, miss. Your banh mi." Silence. Then a soft sound, barely a sob. The door opened wider. But no one stood there. On the floor, just beyond the threshold, was a girl, wrapped in a blanket. Eyes puffy, maybe 20, maybe younger. She didn't reach for the food. She just whispered, "Can you say something else? Anything?" Nam was frozen. Like what? "Just talk, please, like a grandpa would." He stepped in, slowly, unsure. "You know, back in my day, banh mi cost 500 dong. We had to fight each other for the last slice of pork." The girl laughed. A hiccup of a sound, wet and grateful. He placed the bag beside her. "I can stay for 5 minutes. Then I have to head back." She nodded. "That's okay." They didn't talk about what was wrong. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. But he told her about how scooters used to have kickstarts, about how he once delivered food during a flood and still got a 5-star rating, about the time someone ordered 10 banh mi and only tipped 2,000 dong, but left him a drawing of a cat in a helmet. She laughed again. He watched her shoulders relax. When he stood to leave, she looked up. "Thank you." He tilted his head. "For what?" "For being a person, for being real." He nodded, left the apartment, took the stairs more slowly. Back on his scooter, he sat for a long time. The banh mi had only cost 25,000 dong, but what he delivered felt much heavier and far more precious. That night, he didn't go home right away. He drove through the empty streets, not looking for orders, just thinking about how people assume old men ride to survive. But sometimes we ride so others don't feel alone. Even if they're strangers, even if it's 2 a.m., some names stay in your delivery app. Others stay in your heart. After that night, Uncle Nam never received another order from her. Not at 2 a.m., not ever. But she never really disappeared. She lived in the way he looked at dark apartment hallways, in the way he paused outside old buildings, and in the silence he now understood a little too well. It had been 3 weeks. He had hoped for a repeat order. Maybe not at 2 a.m., maybe at 5 p.m., maybe something simple, milk tea, congee. but her name never popped up again. He didn't know her name, really. The order had been anonymous, just an address and a whisper. He passed her building often now, not to stalk, just to check. Once, he thought he saw her at the window. A blur of hair, a shifting curtain, but he wasn't sure. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe memory played tricks. One evening after finishing a late shift, Nam decided to stop. He parked quietly, climbed those familiar stairs, 4th floor. Door 402. He knocked, waited, nothing. He left a small note under the door. Hope you're okay, not here to deliver. Just hoping someone's talking to you today. Uncle Nam. He didn't expect a response, and he didn't get one. 2 weeks later, it rained. The kind of rain that made scooters choke and stall. Nam parked under a bridge, letting the worst of it pass. Another delivery beeped on his phone. He hesitated. It wasn't her building, but it was close. He accepted. When he arrived at the new location, a boy in a hoodie opened the door. Nam handed over the food, but something else caught his eye. A sketch taped to the inside of the boy's wall. It was crude, clearly drawn by hand. A man on a scooter, old, bent slightly, holding a banh mi like a treasure. Nam pointed. That yours? The boy turned. No, my sister drew it, said she met a hero once. Nam blinked. Your sister? She live here now? The boy shook his head. No, she moved to Da Nang last week, needed the ocean. Why the ocean? She said the city made her feel like she couldn't breathe. But the sea, she said, it listens. Nam stood there for a long time. Not because he was sad, but because he understood. Some people don't stay, because the pain does. That night he drove slower, not because of traffic, but because every light reminded him of a window that no longer had a girl behind it, but maybe now had wind and salt and peace. He whispered into his helmet, I hope someone calls you Grandpa there, even once. When he got home, he opened his drawer. Inside was the order receipt from that night. He kept it, not for the address, not for the record, but for the reminder that sometimes what we deliver isn't food, it's presence, it's voice, it's a bridge out of silence. Even just once, some windows never open, and yet they still speak. It had been almost a month since Uncle Nam last saw the girl, or the apartment with the ajar door and trembling voice at 2 a.m. But something about that night stayed with him like a shadow that walked just behind the rearview mirror of his scooter. He kept driving the same route, kept slowing down near Building 42, even when no deliveries called him there. Sometimes he'd even park for a moment, pretend to check the tire pressure or adjust the mirror. But really, he was looking up, at the 4th floor, at the window with the curtain that once moved. But never again. Nam didn't know when it became a habit. Maybe it was that moment when the drawing in the boy's apartment confirmed what his gut had known. She had seen something in him. And now she was gone. Not in the tragic sense, just elsewhere. And sometimes that hurt even more. He started paying more attention to windows, not doors. Doors had intent. People opened and closed them with purpose. But windows witnessed without asking to. They saw the world go by. They saw people leave. They held sunlight, rain, dust, and memory. And they were almost always silent. He began to notice patterns. Apartment 206 had a blinking fairy light string that changed color every Wednesday night. Room 701 always had an empty cup on its ledge. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3. In one building across from the university, there was a room that had its blinds always half open, like someone wanted to see out but couldn't bear to be fully seen. Nam began building stories for them in his head. That one is waiting for someone to return. This one lives alone but pretends not to. That one cries into their pillow at night, but only on weekends. He didn't think he was strange, just attentive. In his job, people expected you to look down at the road, the app, the address. But Nam was looking up now, for signs, for memories. For her, one late evening, a new building pinged on his app. He accepted without thinking. It was an area he rarely visited, a newer complex, fancier. As he waited for the security guard to call up, his eyes drifted to a window on the second floor. The curtain fluttered. Nothing unusual. But then, a small light blinked 3 times, paused, blinked twice. Nam felt a chill. He didn't know Morse code, but that pattern felt intentional. He tried not to overthink it. After delivering the food, he stood outside the building again, looking up. The window was dark now. He shook his head. "I'm getting too old for ghosts," he muttered. But still, he wrote it down in his notebook. Window, second floor, blinked, 3 paused 2. Next to that entry, he wrote, "Felt like something missing." 2 days later, he passed by again, this time without a delivery. Just passing, the window blinked again. Same pattern. 3, pause, 2. Nam did something he hadn't done in years. He waved, a slow, unsure motion. No one waved back, but the curtain moved, just enough. And that was something. Back at home, Nam opened a new page in his notebook. He titled it, "The Silent Windows." He began listing them, each window, each quirk, each possible message. He wasn't sure why, but it made the nights feel less repetitive, more connected, like he wasn't the only one watching. Eli, a young delivery rider who sometimes waited with him at pickup spots, noticed the notebook. "You writing stories?" Nam shook his head. "Just recording things." "Like what?" "Like who still leaves their light on when the world's already asleep." Eli laughed. "You're a poet, Uncle Nam." Nam didn't argue, because maybe he was. Weeks passed. More windows, more stories. And yet, one night as he passed by Building 42 again, he noticed something new. The window, the one that had always been still, had something taped to it. It was a note, too far to read, but the color, light blue, was familiar. He stopped, pulled out his cheap binoculars, ones he'd once bought at a flea market, never used. The note said, "Thank you for being real." His hands shook. He didn't cry, not yet, but the air felt fuller, like someone had filled in the blank, like the silence had finally spoken. He sat on his scooter, didn't start it, just breathed, and whispered, "You're welcome." That night in his journal, he wrote, "Some people say nothing when they leave, but they still leave echoes, windows, paper notes, memories wrapped in moonlight. Tonight I felt seen, not as a delivery driver, but as a person who arrived and was received." The next day the note was gone, but Nam didn't mind, because now he knew. She hadn't forgotten, and neither had he. Sometimes the most important deliveries are the ones no one places. They just happen, because something bigger, call it fate, chance, or the ache of an unseen heart, wants them to. That was what Uncle Nam would come to understand one quiet evening when the city buzzed as usual. But the silence between his breaths said something else was coming. It was a Thursday, one of those in-between days. Not the rush of the weekend, not the drag of a Monday, just Thursday. Nam had just finished delivering a hot bowl of pho to a tired mother on the 8th floor of a creaky building when his phone buzzed, but not with an order. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Hi, I don't need food, but I heard you deliver something more." No name, no address. Nam stared at it. His finger hovered over the reply button. Then another text came. "I'm at Building 17, back entrance. Please don't ask questions. I just, need to hear a story." Nam hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was a prank, or worse, a trap. But something about the tone, the vulnerability behind the digital words, touched the same nerve that had been raw since that 2 a.m. order. He grabbed an extra banh mi from his insulated box and drove. Building 17 was nothing special, mid-rise, gray, a little chipped around the edges. Nam parked beside a dumpster, the back entrance barely lit by a flickering bulb. He waited. 3 minutes passed. 5. Then he saw her. A girl, maybe late teens, thin, hoodie pulled over her head. She approached slowly, hands in pockets. Nam stood, didn't speak. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled 50,000 dong note. He shook his head. I didn't bring food to sell. She looked up, eyes red. You, Uncle Nam? He blinked. How do you know my name? She smiled weakly. Everyone does. At least those of us who don't sleep much. Nam felt something twist in his chest. Why did you text me? Because I heard you told a girl stories once. And she stopped crying. He sat on the edge of the curb, patted the space beside him. She sat. For the next 20 minutes, he told her the story of the lost puppy who once followed his scooter for 3 blocks until he gave it a ride in the delivery box. He told her about the time he accidentally delivered to the wrong apartment and ended up being fed 3 bowls of shay by a lonely grandmother who mistook him for her son's friend. He told her about a boy named Eli who once sketched him mid-delivery and called him a hero. She laughed, not loudly, but enough. Then came the silence, the kind that sits between 2 people who both know something deeper needs to be said. I'm tired, she whispered. Of school? Of pretending? Of disappearing into my own life? Nam didn't respond, not right away. He looked up at the sky. It was unusually clear. He pointed. See that star? She nodded. That's you. She frowned. I don't glow, I barely function. Exactly. Stars don't glow for themselves, they glow for others. Even when they're burning out, they still light the sky. You're here talking to me. That's light. She wiped a tear. You always talk like this, only to those who need it. She stood suddenly. I have to go, but thank you. Nam handed her the banh mi. You'll need this more than I do. She took it. Then without warning, she hugged him. Quickly, like a whisper of gratitude, then vanished into the building. Nam sat there for a long while, not moving, just breathing in the scent of distant kitchens, rusted stairwells, and the quiet echo of being useful. He never got her name. But 2 nights later, another anonymous message came. Still glowing, thank you. He replied, keep burning. Quiet light saves more people than loud ones ever could. The next day at the delivery station, Eli nudged him. Heard you're the city's new therapist. Nam grinned. I just deliver banh mi. Yeah, Eli said, smirking. And people just need calories. That night, Nam made an entry in his notebook. The order that wasn't placed gave the most meaning. Some people don't need food. They need a story, a breath, a moment. They need someone who won't ask, won't fix, won't run. Just someone who shows up, even when they're not called. He closed the notebook, tucked it beside his scooter helmet, and whispered into the night. Keep going. Someone's watching. Someone needs your light. Some people leave reviews. Others leave something more permanent. Something you can't rate with stars. Something that sticks, not just to a wall, but to your heart. Uncle Nam didn't expect the drawing. But then again, he didn't expect to become the kind of person someone would draw. It had been raining for 3 days straight. Not a downpour, but that steady, curtain-like kind of rain that turns motorbike seats into puddles and alleys into rivers. Nam had just delivered a Banquan order to a cramped little bookstore tucked between 2 apartment blocks. He was on his way back down the slippery stairs when he saw it. A paper, taped to the stairwell wall, slightly curled from the damp air. It wasn't printed. It wasn't typed. It was drawn. In pencil. At first glance, it looked like a child's sketch. Simple lines, uneven proportions. But when Nam looked closer, his breath caught. It was him, helmet slightly askew, sitting on his scooter, holding a banh mi in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. The scooter was labeled Uncle Nam Express. In the corner, a single line of handwriting. You delivered more than food. He didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough for the steam from his previous delivery to fog up his glasses. Long enough for someone to come down the stairs behind him and whisper, "That's you, right?" The voice belonged to a teenage boy in a hoodie, same one from Building 17. Nam turned. "You again?" The boy smiled. "You left a story behind. Someone drew it." "Who?" The boy shrugged. "She didn't leave a name, just taped it up and left. Said the stairwell needed something human." Nam nodded slowly. "She's right." He didn't take the drawing. He left it there. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the wall, to the people who would pass by, to the ones who needed to see it and be reminded. Someone had noticed. Someone had mattered. Someone had delivered something real. Later that evening, he returned with a clear plastic sheet, taped it over the drawing, protected it from the rain. He didn't sign it, didn't take credit. He just made sure it stayed. The next day, someone added to it a second sheet of paper, drawn in crayon. This one showed a little girl holding her grandmother's hand. Behind them, a scooter, same helmet, same label, Uncle Nam Express. The caption said, "You helped my grandma walk again. She said your words made her legs feel lighter." Nam stared at it, trying to remember. When had he said that? Which delivery? Which building? He couldn't place it. And that somehow made it even more real. Eli heard about it next. "You started an art exhibit without me?" Nam chuckled. "Wasn't me." "You're on a wall. That's a gallery now." Nam shrugged. "Guess I'm modern art." Over the next week, more drawings appeared. A collage, all centered around a quiet man with a scooter and a kind smile. Some were detailed, others barely stick figures. But all carried the same message. He was there. He mattered. He saw us. The wall became known in the neighborhood. People passed by just to see what was new. Some left flowers. One woman taped up a receipt from a banh mi order dated 2 years ago with a note. "You were the first person to speak to me kindly after my divorce. I never forgot." Nam read it all. He never told anyone which ones he remembered, which faces matched which nights. He just let the wall tell its story. One evening, Eli brought a group of student filmmakers. "They want to make a documentary." Nam waved them off. "I'm not a hero," one of the students said, "but you're a mirror." Nam blinked. "What does that mean?" "You reflect what people need. That's rarer than being heroic." That night, Nam rode home slower than usual. The wind was cold, but something inside him felt warm. He passed a familiar alley, slowed, looked up. The window on the 4th floor, curtained still, but he no longer needed it to move. Because he knew. She had drawn first, and now others followed. At home, he opened his journal. Wrote, "Some deliveries echo, others ripple. Some ripple so far they start drawing the outline of who you really are. I never asked to be remembered. But if they do, I hope they remember the silence I helped soften and the warmth I left behind, even if it started with just one sandwich." He closed the book, set it beside his helmet, and whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you for drawing me into your story." Some days feel different. Even before they begin, the air is heavier, the silence louder. The world seems to pause, as if waiting for something. That morning, Uncle Nam woke before sunrise, as always. But something was off. His bones ached more than usual. His chest felt tight, not painfully so, but with a kind of weight that reminded him of monsoon clouds just before the sky opened up. He sat at the edge of his bed for longer than usual. The helmet hung on the wall, the delivery jacket draped over the back of a chair. But he didn't reach for either. Not yet. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. He poured himself tea. The scent of jasmine calmed him, as it always did. He took out his notebook, the one that had followed him for years now. The one where each page was a delivery, a face, a window, a word not spoken aloud. He stared at the last entry. "Thank you for drawing me into your story." His fingers hovered over the next page, then lowered. Today he felt no story coming. Today he wouldn't write. And for the first time in months, he wouldn't ride. Eli noticed first. The morning dispatch group chat buzzed with orders, complaints, and jokes about soggy banh mi, but there was no emoji from Nam, no sunrise selfie from the station, no good luck kids message with a thumbs up sticker. Eli texted him directly. No reply. He called. No answer. By 10 a.m., the wall at the stairwell had a new addition. A child had drawn a scooter, but this time it was parked. No rider. A small heart floated above it. Below, written in block letters, "Where is Uncle Nam today?" By noon, 3 more drawings appeared. One with a sad face, one with an empty helmet, and one with a scooter trail leading into a cloud. Eli arrived around 1 p.m. He saw the wall. His stomach turned. He didn't want to panic, but something felt wrong. He rode to Nam's apartment, knocked gently. No answer. He knocked louder. Still silence. Then shuffling, the door opened a crack. Nam stood there. No helmet, no smile, just tired eyes. "Uncle," Eli said, trying to sound casual. "You okay?" Nam nodded slowly, then sat down right there in the doorway. "I just didn't feel like delivering today," he said. Eli blinked. That wasn't the man he knew. "That's okay," Eli replied. "You don't owe anyone anything." Nam shook his head. "That's just it. I feel like I do." He paused, looked at his hands. "They've all given me stories, faces, names, moments, and I just ride around collecting them like lucky coins. But what have I given back, really?" Eli sat beside him. "You gave them hope. You gave them something no one else bothered to." Nam chuckled dryly. "Old man in a creaky scooter isn't exactly a superhero." Eli smiled. "No, but you're a lighthouse." That word sat between them. Lighthouse. Not fast, not flashy, but steady, unmoving, always there. Even when it's not shining. Nam looked up. "You think anyone noticed I didn't show up?" Eli laughed. They turned the wall into a missing persons board. Nam's eyes widened. "They did?" Drawings, notes, even a paper crane with your name written on the wings. Later that evening, Nam stood in front of the wall himself. He hadn't planned to. He just ended up there. The drawings greeted him like old friends. And new ones. One note read, "You once told me the rain would pass. You were right." Another, "I stopped crying after I talked to you. I hope you're not crying today." And another, "Your scooter sound is the soundtrack of my street. I missed it today." Nam read each one, some twice. He stood there until the streetlights blinked on. Back at home, he sat with his notebook again. This time he wrote, "I didn't deliver today, but today I received messages, drawings, love I didn't ask for but needed more than I knew. Maybe this is what delivery really means. Not arriving, but being missed." He closed the book, stared at the helmet on the wall, then smiled. At exactly 7:32 p.m., his phone buzzed. An order. No note, no special request. Just one banh mi. But it came from a familiar building. Apartment 402. Nam stared at it, then picked up his helmet and whispered, "Let's ride." Some addresses echo louder than others. And sometimes when you think the past has closed its door, It leaves it just slightly ajar. Uncle Nam stared at the screen for a long time. Apartment 402. The number pulsed like a heartbeat. He hadn't delivered there since that night. The 2 a.m. night. The whispered voice. The girl wrapped in a blanket. The tears that weren't his but somehow felt like they belonged in his chest. Now, months later, 402 called again. No special instructions. Just a simple order. One banh mi. No drink. No message. Nam put on his jacket slowly, slid on his helmet, adjusted the strap the way he always did. He checked the banh mi twice, wrapped it carefully, tucked a folded napkin beside it like a silent offering. He didn't know what to expect, or who, or why now, but he had to go. The ride was familiar. The turns, the corners, the traffic lights blinking sleepily in the evening haze. He parked at the same spot, locked his scooter, stood still for a moment, looking up at the 4th floor. A light was on. That was something. He climbed the stairs. His knees ached more than before. His breaths came shorter, but he didn't stop. Door 402. He knocked, softly. The door opened slowly. It was her. Older? Maybe. Her hair tied back, eyes clearer. But it was her. The girl from 2 a.m. She smiled. Hi. Nam blinked. You ordered? She nodded. I wasn't sure you'd still be delivering. He handed her the food. I wasn't sure you'd still be here. She stepped aside. Come in? He hesitated, then entered. The apartment looked the same, but cleaner, warmer. A bookshelf now stood in the corner. A small plant bloomed on the windowsill. She set the food on the table, untouched. I didn't order because I was hungry, she said, echoing her words from that night. I ordered because I needed to say thank you. Nam sat slowly. I didn't do much. You did enough. She poured him tea. Jasmine, his favorite. He took a sip, let the warmth settle in his chest. I moved away, she said, right after that night, to Da Nang. The ocean helped. I heard. She smiled. I left the sketch at the boy's apartment on purpose. I hoped it would find you. It did. She looked down. I came back last week, not permanently, just for a visit. And I thought if you were still writing, I'd know it was okay to come back. Nam felt his throat tighten. I'm still writing? I see that. They talked for an hour. About nothing, about everything. About quiet nights, about healing, about how cities forget people, but sometimes one person can remember enough for both. I'm studying counseling now, she said. I want to be someone who shows up, like you. Nam didn't answer right away. Then he said, you already are. She smiled, wiped her eyes. Before he left, she handed him an envelope. Don't open it until you're home. He nodded. Outside, the air smelled of rain. He rode home slower than usual, not because of traffic, but because part of him was still back there in apartment 402. At home, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a photo. The photo showed a drawing. His scooter with wings instead of wheels. Underneath, you lifted me. The letter read, Dear Uncle Nam, I was broken the night I met you. I didn't need food. I needed a reason to believe people could still be kind. You didn't ask questions. You just stayed. You talked like I mattered. And that changed something in me. Since then, I've spoken to others the way you spoke to me. One day, I hope someone draws a picture of me. But if they do, I hope you're in it too. Because you were the beginning. Love, thou. Nam read it twice, then 3 times. Then folded it carefully and placed it in his journal. He didn't write an entry that night. He didn't need to. Some deliveries write themselves. Some are made of words. Some are made of healing. And some are made of return. The next morning, Eli asked him why he looked different. Nam just smiled. Apartment 402, he said. Eli raised an eyebrow. Nam simply tapped his heart. It's open now. Even the most faithful machines have their breaking point. And sometimes when things fall apart, they reveal what was holding them and us together all along. It was a Wednesday evening when it happened. The sky wore the dull gray of exhaustion. The city felt slower than usual, as if every soul on every corner had collectively exhaled and didn't quite remember how to inhale again. Uncle Nam had just finished a delivery near the hospital, a bowl of chow for an old woman who thanked him with a silent nod and a trembling smile. He strapped his helmet, sat on his scooter, and turned the key. Click, click, nothing. He tried again. No cough, no whir, just silence. He dismounted, checked the wires under the seat, jiggled the ignition. Still nothing. The scooter, his old companion, the one with more miles than memory, had finally stopped. He sat beside it on the curb. For the first time in years, he felt still. Not by choice, but by necessity. The wind moved around him. A motorbike zipped by. A dog barked in the distance. But in his little bubble, there was only silence, oil, and the quiet ticking of metal cooling down. Eli was the first to call. You still out? Nam didn't answer right away. Then my scooter gave up. I'll come get you. No, Uncle, come on. I want to stay. Just a while. It feels like she deserves a goodbye. Eli hesitated, then said softly, Okay, I'll bring tea. 15 minutes later, Eli arrived with a thermos. He didn't ask questions, just poured 2 cups and sat beside Nam. She really gone? Nam nodded. No spark, no hum, just quiet. She's earned it, Eli said. Nam smiled. She's carried me through 10 years, through monsoons, through silence, through loneliness. Eli looked at the scooter. You gave her meaning. Nam shook his head. She gave me presents. As they sat, something unexpected happened. A boy approached. Maybe 9 or 10, backpack slung loose. He stopped, looked at Nam, at the scooter. You're the man from the drawing, he said. Nam blinked. What drawing? The wall, near my building. Everyone talks about you. The boy sat too, without invitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then came another, a woman with shopping bags. She smiled gently. I used to order from you after my divorce. She didn't need to say more. Nam remembered. Her name, her address, her quiet eyes. She sat as well, followed by an older man with a cane, then a student with headphones, and a nurse from the hospital across the street. Within 30 minutes, Nam was surrounded. A circle of stories. Each one a delivery, each one a thread, each one now returning. They didn't come to help with the scooter. They came for him. To sit, to offer company, to return what he had given, presents. One girl brought, been me. Just in case you're hungry. Someone else brought a blanket. It might get cold. Someone else brought a photo. You once told me I'd survive. I did. Nam listened. To each voice. To each silence between the words. He didn't know how to thank them. So he didn't try. He just smiled. Eli leaned in. You see what you built? Nam looked around. Not built, he said. Just delivered one moment at a time. Eli nodded. And now they're delivering you. As the night deepened, someone brought tools. A younger delivery rider, new to the city, eager. Mind if I try? Nam watched as the boy worked. Gentle hands, careful touch. 10 minutes later, the scooter coughed, sputtered, then hummed. Alive. The group cheered softly, not loudly, respectfully, like a farewell that wasn't final. Nam stood, touched the seat. It's not the same anymore, he said. But it's still enough, Eli replied. Before they all dispersed, the boy who arrived first asked, Will you keep delivering? Nam smiled. I think I'll keep arriving. That night in his journal, he wrote, "Tonight the scooter stopped, and in that stillness they came, not to fix the machine, but to remind me I had not been riding alone. Every but me, every word, every silent presence, they mattered. And now they've returned. Some things break, not to end, but to show what held them together all along." He closed the journal, looked at the scooter, taped a tiny sticker to sticker to the side, a small hand-drawn heart, and underneath it, still delivering. There are streets that forget you the moment you pass, and there are streets that remember every turn of your wheels. The latter had become Uncle Nam's street, not because he owned it, not because he claimed it, but because he showed up day after day until the pavement remembered his weight, until the people learned the sound of his scooter and associated it with something more than food, with presence, with care, with him. After the night his scooter broke down, something changed, not just in the machine, but in the rhythm of the city. People started looking out for him, not in a way that made him feel old, but in a way that made him feel rooted. The coffee vendor on the corner left a second cup on the table, just in case. The florist tied a small bloom to her daily delivery in case he passed by. And the old security guard at Building 42 nodded more deeply, sometimes slipping him a boiled egg with a grin. Nam wasn't sure when the street had turned into a neighborhood, not just a place with buildings, but a place where people noticed, people cared. He rode slower these days, not because his scooter was weaker, but because there was more to see, more to acknowledge, more hellos to give. One morning he turned onto lane 17 and saw chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A scooter, a helmet, stick figures waving. Below, in careful handwriting, "He brings stories, not just sandwiches." He parked, stared at it. A girl appeared from a nearby doorway. "Uncle, do you like it?" Nam turned. "Did you draw this?" She nodded. "Me and my friends, we wanted to say thank you." "For what?" She looked confused. "For noticing us." The words stayed with him all day. Not delivering, not feeding, but noticing. It was simple, but powerful. In a city of millions, the act of being seen could feel like magic. And somehow he'd become the magician. That afternoon, his route took him through a narrow alley where a boy sat beside a broken bike. Nam slowed. The boy didn't call for help, didn't wave, but Nam stopped anyway. Chain came off. The boy nodded. Nam knelt. His knees creaked in protest, but he didn't care. 10 minutes later, the bike was whole again. The boy looked up. "You're not a mechanic." Nam grinned. "I'm not a lot of things, but I try." News traveled, not in headlines, not on screens, but through whispers, through shared glances, through sidewalk stories. Uncle Nam became more than the old man on the scooter. He became a part of the street, a chapter in its daily unfolding. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, a teenager ran up to him. "Uncle, wait!" Nam stopped. The boy handed him a folded note. Nam opened it. A simple sentence. "You delivered to my mom when she was sick. She's better now. She remembers your smile more than the food." Nam looked up. The boy had already run off. That night, he sat on a bench by the street, watched as lights flickered on, watched as windows glowed. He didn't make any deliveries that hour, but it felt like he had. He began to recognize patterns. Which windows blinked on first? Which doors creaked at exactly 6:15 p.m.? Which cats lounged on which steps? And which silences meant someone inside needed someone to knock, even without an order? The street had begun to wait for him, not impatiently, but hopefully, a kind of gentle expectation. One rainy day, when he didn't appear until late, a little boy asked the fruit vendor, "Did something happen to the sandwich man?" She replied, "No, darling. He's just running late. Even angels get stuck in traffic." Nam heard about it the next day. He laughed. "Angel? That's new." Eli grinned. "They're upgrading you." He didn't feel like an angel, just a man with a scooter and a heart that had learned how to stay open, even when tired, even when sad, even when forgotten by the rest of the world. Because this street remembered, this street waited, and sometimes that was enough. At the end of that week, Nam found a letter taped to the wall of the building where the drawings first appeared. It read, "Dear Uncle Nam, you don't know me, but I know your scooter sound. It means my brother will get dinner. It means my mom will smile. It means the street is alive. When you're not here, we notice. So please, keep writing. We'll keep waiting." Nam folded it slowly, held it to his chest, and whispered, "Then I'll keep going." That night in his journal, he wrote, "A street is more than concrete and corners. It's memory. It's presence. It's people waiting, not just for food, but for the sound of someone who always returns. And I will, until I can't. And even then, maybe, the street will remember." Some stories don't end. They simply arrive at a place where they can rest. And if you listen closely, the silence that follows isn't absence. It's gratitude. Uncle Nam's morning began with a breeze. Cool, crisp, unusual for that time of year. He stepped out of bed slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because everything felt suspended, like the world had paused to let something through. His helmet hung in its usual spot. His jacket was neatly folded. His scooter was still waiting, parked just beyond the window. Nothing had changed. And yet everything felt different. He made his tea. Jasmine sat by the window, watched as the city began to stir. First the shop owners, then the delivery bikes, then the sleepy school children with reluctant steps. He sipped slowly. Then his phone buzzed. An order. It came with no name, no special notes. Just one item, banh mi, and an address. He stared at it. The building was unfamiliar. The number wasn't on any of his usual routes, but something about it pulled him, gently, like a familiar hand on the shoulder. He wrapped the banh mi with care, checked his scooter. It started on the first try. The hum was strong. The ride was smooth. He passed streets that had once been strangers, but now nodded at him. Children waved. Vendors smiled. Eli, waiting at a corner, gave a thumbs up. Nam returned it, not with his hand, but with a smile so soft it could only be understood by those who knew what goodbye looked like without saying the word. The address led to a house, not an apartment. Old, wooden gates, ivy creeping over brick. He parked, knocked. A woman opened the door, elderly, kind eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. He's waiting inside. Nam didn't ask who. He followed her. In the back room, a man lay on a hospital bed, breathing, but barely. He turned his head slowly, smiled. "I didn't think you'd come." Nam approached. "I didn't know you were calling." The man chuckled. "My granddaughter placed the order, said she found your name on a wall of drawings." Nam blinked. "She told me if I had one more meal left in me, it should be delivered by someone who still believes in presence." Nam placed the banh mi on the bedside table, but the man didn't reach for it. He simply asked, "Will you sit?" Nam nodded and sat. They talked for an hour, maybe more, about everything and nothing. About bread that crumbles too quickly. About coffee that only tastes right when shared. About regrets that in the end feel smaller than the silences we filled them with. The man's voice faded near the end. "I wasn't afraid of dying," he whispered. "I was afraid no one would come." Nam touched his hand gently. "I came." "Yes," the man said, "you did." Nam left quietly. Didn't ask the woman's name. Didn't wait for thanks. He just stepped outside, took a deep breath. The wind carried jasmine. Somehow, he rode aimlessly after that, not to deliver, but to arrive. At old corners, familiar sidewalks. He stopped at the stairwell wall. The drawings were still there, some faded, some fresh. Someone had added a new one, a scooter floating among stars. Underneath, still delivering, just in another sky. Nam smiled, took out his notebook, wrote his final entry. There will be a day I don't ride again, but let it not be today. Let it be the day after I've delivered everything I was meant to. Let it be the day when my silence is not absence, but memory. He closed the notebook, taped a copy of the drawing to his scooter, then started it. The engine purred, the tires rolled, and the street remembered because he came, because he stayed, because he delivered. That evening, the alley lights blinked as if nodding. Someone leaned out their window. Uncle Nam, but the scooter was already gone, carrying stories, carrying presents, carrying love. And though no one knew which delivery would be the last, everyone agreed. He had never missed one.